Hello there, friends, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Teresa McCloy, and I am your host here for this podcast. My co host, Erica Vinson, is not able to be with us for this particular episode. Starting with this episode, we are actually changing up the format a little bit to this podcast, and going forward, it will be called the Real Life Conversations for Christian Coaches. This podcast is changing gears once again, and we'll be switching over to a new name called Real Life Conversations for Christian Coaches. Now, that being said, we are always so glad that you're listening in, and this podcast will be niching down, narrowing down its focus just a bit, but we will still have the same real conversations to help you grow. It's just coming down to one particular audience, and that audience is actually Christian coaches. And I'll give you some of the backstory on how I got to this and where it's going. But we really are excited, Eric and I both, about where this is headed as we help Christian coaches grow a successful coaching business, but still stay grounded in what truly matters. We're going to continue to share practical tools, honest conversations, our own experience as coaches, as well as inviting some great guests, some great coaches onto the show to support you as a coach as you live from something that I've been talking about for several years now called a place of rest, not rush. As Erica and I have talked and discerned and thought about where we want to take the podcast, one of the things that we are both very passionate about is helping coaches grow successful businesses, but without all the hype that you hear so much in the marketplace. Because in so many ways, I think that goes against how we want to show up as coaches who are coaching from a place that's deeply rooted in our faith. So you may not be a Christian coach and you may have listened to this podcast for a long time. Believe me, you can continue to listen in. You're going to learn great things about business, about how to show up for others, how to coach internally within your organization or the business that you run. But we want you to know where the podcast is headed. And there's a story behind this, and I'll be glad to share it with you as we get into today's conversation. So let's dive in. This podcast has actually been around since 2019. I started it as a solo podcast that I was doing myself. I launched it in January of 2019, just about 2.5 years after I'd been working as a coach. And one of the things that I knew early on in my coaching business is that I wanted a podcast. It's one of my favorite ways to communicate is through speaking. Now I've written a book and I've done some other things, but at the time, speaking was my biggest passion. And in some ways, that's come full circle. I'll share more with you about that as we get into today's episode. But back in 2019, I was really beginning to form my coaching business. And one of the things that I was using a lot was a tool known as the Enneagram Personality Profile or the Enneagram. So I decided in 2019 that I would go all in on the Enneagram. So when this podcast first started, it was called the Enneagram in Your Real Life. I was already starting to use that terminology. I was working on a coaching framework that I had come up with, but I knew that I wanted my podcast to be very unique to a certain tool, to something that people could really wrap their minds around. I remember a funny story from that time period. One of my mentors at the time, my dear friend Dan Miller, who passed away a few years ago, actually recommended I not do the podcast around the Enneagram, which is so funny because later on he's, Teresa, I think you were right. And I may have been wrong on this one because at the time, the Enneagram was a very popular tool. That podcast was actually one of the top podcasts around the Enneagram. We often were in the top 10 podcasts around the tool, the Enneagram. But I knew that I didn't want to just be a coach who used the Enneagram or an Enneagram coach. That wasn't what I wanted to be known for. I knew that God had so much more for me to do and ways to show up. Now, I still love the tool. We still use it and talk about it in some of our certification. It's not a requirement for our coaches to use that tool, but it is something that we reference and talk about quite a bit because it's been a huge tool in my life in just my formation, not adding to the scripture, not taking away from the scripture, but just a tool for what it is. So that's how my podcast started. And for the first 89 episodes, that's what I did. About a year and a half in, as I grew my coaching business, I actually knew that I wanted to switch over and make the podcast more about the framework of the coaching process that we have called the real life process. And this is a 4 component framework that we work in. I was also beginning to think about writing a book. And so I wanted the podcast to match up with all of that content. And so we switched over to a podcast called the Real Life Process Podcast. We actually were named the Real Life Process Podcast from 2020. Y'all remember back in those days, all the way through June of 2023. About a year before that, my book actually came out. The book that I authored called Doing What Matters, Live from Rest, Not Rush. And I'll talk about this more next week when Eric and I come back and talk about our coaching journeys and just how we got into coaching and we both grew as coaches. But in 2022, when the book came out, it was a lot around my framework of the real life process, the life management process, the rule of life process that I was beginning to use. We had started certifying other coaches in that process during 2020, during the time of COVID when we were all locked down. And podcasting was changing. Lots was going on in the world as we were all locked down for that year. And as my business evolved, as I started thinking about writing the book, and then the book finally came out in 2022, I knew once again in June of 2023 that I wanted to make another switch to the podcast. Again, this is part of the evolution of any business, is how it switches and how it changes. And the podcast has been a huge part of my business journey. So in 2023, we switched over to the Doing What Matters podcast, matched the title of my book, and just playing off of that brand and that name, we wanted to lean in to having a podcast that matched the book title and a lot of what we were doing in the brand. That podcast really, for me, was a hard season. I'm going to be honest, from 2023 until 2024, that whole year, for many reasons, was a hard year for me in podcasting. I saw it reflect in my numbers. If I'm authentic and I'm honest with you, I was a little confused. Who's my audience? Who am I talking to? But what am I doing on this podcast? And here's why. Because in my business, I also had a lot of things going on from 2022 to 2024. Many things were going well for me in my business, but I lost a little bit of what am I doing? Who am I talking to? I have clients in my local community, small business owners that I love working with. I actually even have an office in my local community. I train and certify other coaches in our content and our process here at the Real Life Process. I teach and train others in that rule of life management system so coaches can use it. We've trained almost real close to 100 coaches in the last several years, which is amazing. And I do some speaking and some training and some workshops. Again, remember me saying I love to speak. So all of these things are going on for about 2 years. And last September, actually early in 2024, I knew that I needed to step away. I'd had the business for almost 7 years. It was time for me to step back and just take a look at all these things I'm doing. I'd also walked through a difficult season of just a couple years ago. I lost my best friend to cancer, and she was also a part of our team here at the Real Life Process. It It was a really heavy load of grief. And it was right after the book had come out and been released. And so just so much going on that the last 18 months or 2 years were just a lot of confusion for me. Wonderful, great things God was blessing us with, but just confusion on who are we and where's our direction. So I decided last fall to step back. And I announced to my team early in 2024 that I'm going to take a sabbatical. What am I going to do? All these things. So where are we going? What's the plan? You can listen to some of those podcast episodes and you can hear it even in my voice. I knew God had me, but I just didn't know what was going to be on the other side of the sabbatical. The announcement I'm giving you today about the change of this podcast is actually some of what's on the other side of sabbatical. Sabbatical was wonderful. I enjoyed it. I took most of November and December off and even part of October. And the team did amazing. We did a great job planning for sabbatical. But when it came to January of this past year, January of 2025, I knew when I came back that some things were going to change and shift. I'll be honest, I just kept waiting for God to give me the big download of what is it? What is changing? What is shifting? And as we went through the first quarter, January, February, March, I'm like, I'm not getting it yet, God. I don't know what we're shifting to. In many ways, I had to come back in that first quarter and restart my business because I had let go of almost everything from bringing in new certified coaches to a new community that we started called the Real Life Practice Community to coaching here in my local community, all of those things, speaking, everything went on hold during sabbatical. So when I came back early this year, it was like starting everything back up again and really started to feel, okay, this is too much. As a high achieving, high deep personality, type 3 on the Enneagram, I was feeling that if I wasn't careful, sabbatical would be for nothing and I would take it all back on. And I just kept waiting for God to say what. And about 30 to 45 days ago, I began to get the fruits of sabbatical. And I began to see what really I wanted to lean into. And some conversations that I had with family, some conversations that I had with friends brought me to the realization that one of my deepest passions, when I think of myself and just who I am, and this wouldn't be right for everyone, but this is what I have discerned for myself, that one of my greatest passions is helping Christian coaches grow their businesses. It is why when people started asking me back in 2019, 2020, Teresa, I love the framework that you've built for coaches. I love this rule of life process that you've built. I love what you're doing to teach coaches how to walk people through some of this content that you have. Could I use it too? And when I started sharing with other coaches and started pouring into them and helping them build their businesses like I had built mine, and pulling from my entrepreneurial journey of owning a brick and mortar business, running several businesses out of my home, helping my husband run our farm operation that we run here, pulling from all of those things and helping coaches brought me the greatest joy. Now, I love helping small business owners, and I can do that well. And I do that for a handful of clients here in my local community. But my biggest passion, where I want to pour life into over the next several years, is helping Christian coaches grow their business. Now, they might call themselves several different things. Some people might call themselves a mentor, a guide, a coach, a spiritual formation coach, a retreat leader. They may work internally within a faith-based nonprofit organization. I'm not worried about the title, but we call them coaches. They're coming alongside and they're showing up as a coach. And I want to have real life conversations about those things here on the podcast. Let me say this. Here's what's going to be the same as you show up and listen to the podcast. We're still going to have very personal and honest conversations. Erica and I are showing up as two coaches on the journey with you, alongside of you, to have honest conversations. What does it mean to grow yourself as a coach, to keep yourself spiritually grounded in your faith and in how you show up, no matter how you're showing up, to continue to encourage you? So, practical tools is what we want to give you, practical frameworks from both the process and other frameworks that we know. We also want to help form in you something that I've developed in the last few years called the 7 P's of business for Christian coaches. Now, I do that for all kinds of businesses, but I want to be specific about how it is for Christian coaches, because this is what I've learned over the years of working with coaches that come into this work. Is somebody has said you'd be a great coach, but they have no idea how to run a business or how to have a business, whether that's full-time or part-time. We want to talk about coaching tools. We want to continue to interview and have great conversations with real coaches and professionals that integrate their faith and their business and soul care. So you'll still hear from myself and from Erica and from our guests who are living out the coaching life in very meaningful and intentional ways. Now, what's going to be new? That's what's the same. What's going to be new? So we're going to dive even deeper now that I know and Erica knows exactly who we're talking to. We're not like, if you own a business or if you're a coach. No, we're going to assume that you're showing up, helping others as a coach. And so our focus is going to be on the framework that we use, how to apply coaching in businesses, series that we'll do on business growth, spiritual formation for you as a coach for your own self, behind the scenes of being a certified coach with us, and a place to explore what it means to serve our clients well. How do we show up as our best real selves for our clients? So this doesn't matter if you're just starting out or if you're been building a coaching business for a long time and you just need to be in good conversations, listening in on how to keep your skills sharp, how to keep your soul awake and aware. We're here to support you, both your real life and your real work. We often say at the real life process, we call it your real self, your real life, and your real work. We don't want you to just live through the lens of work and not ever do anything for yourself. In fact, one of the things I'm most proud of is last year in the fall, I knew that I was going on sabbatical and we made a couple of switches. Erica came on as a co-host for me here on this podcast. Erica is one of my dearest, longest friends. And as she has become a coach, and I've watched the beauty of her growing as one of the best coaches I know, that I knew that coming alongside me in this podcast would just be an amazing addition for you to hear, for you to learn, for you to get to know Erica and the beauty that she brings to coaching. Her and I are very different in our personalities, but we complement each other so well. So I can't wait for her to continue to co-host this podcast with me as we dive into these real life conversations for Christian coaches. Now, the other thing that I did last fall is that we have a second sister podcast called the Real Life Practice Podcast. And another one of my dear friends, Lindsay Sturkey, who also works on our team and is a certified spiritual director, as am I. Her and I do a podcast, the Real Life Practice Podcast, that is done in 6 weeks series where we do 6 episodes on a particular spiritual practice or spiritual tool. And so we have talked about journaling. We have talked about silence and solitude. We're getting ready to kick off a series on retreats and how to go away on retreat. So you may want to also start to dial in on the Real Life Practice podcast, which is really talking about that real self piece and how you practice it in your everyday, ordinary life. I think that is such an important part of who we are as coaches. Now, Eric and I will talk about those things here, but we will incorporate them and integrate them into the conversations that we're having. So there'll be so many things that are going to stay the same. So if you've been a listener for a long time, don't go anywhere. Stay with us. Join us as we come together in this conversation. But if you are finding us and you're brand new, we would love for you to subscribe to the podcast. So many things have changed around podcasting, and subscriptions are huge, and the algorithms and how things are shared out. We also now are doing all of these podcasts on video. So you can find us on YouTube at The Real Life Process on our YouTube channel, and you'll see the different playlists, and you'll see a new playlist for the Real Life Conversations for Christian Coaches. And you can dive right in there and start to turn on YouTube on your phone, on your TV, on your iPad, wherever you like to watch. You can either listen or you can watch and listen, and find us on YouTube as well. So please subscribe. If you aren't sure if you're subscribed or not, go hit that follow button on your favorite podcast player and subscribe to the podcast. Subscribe over on the YouTube channel so you don't miss out on anything that we have coming up for you. The other thing we'd love to invite you to do, for a few years now, we have had a free community for those that show up with others. Whatever title you call yourself, we have Real Life Process Community. Now, it is off of the normal social media platforms because we just want to have it be in a different place and live in a different place. So it lives on a platform called Circle. But if you go to thereallifeprocess.com and click up on the top there on the website, that's our website. And if you click on the top and you click on community, you can come in and be a part of that community. And that's where listeners to this podcast will be joining. You can also see the practice podcast resources there, have conversations with myself, with Erica, with Lindsay, as we all come around this idea of showing up for others, that invitation to walk alongside others in their journey of their faith, their journey of the work that they are doing out in the world. So in coaching, a lot of times, one of the competencies as you show up as a coach is, what are the growth steps? What are the next actions that you want to take? And we're going to try to do that every week here on the podcast, is give you some growth steps. So the growth steps for this particular episode is to subscribe to the podcast. Now that you know exactly who it's for, you know who I'm talking to, there's no confusion anymore. Subscribe to the podcast. And if you would, pay us the compliment of sharing the podcast with a fellow coach. If you know that they are someone who shows up with others in coaching, share this podcast with them so they can come in and listen in to the resources and the learning and the growth. And then join the Real Life Process community at thereallifeprocess.com. So 2 growth steps, all just about us getting in community together and being in community together. I am very excited. I'm very grateful for the time I had on sabbatical to clear my head, my heart, and my body, and to just be with God and then see the fruits of where that's going. Probably more excited about where business and work and the direction that God has for me than I have been in a long time, in a couple of years. And it happens as we grow in business. It's very common to say, oh, I got a little off track over here. How do I get back on the road that I want to be on? And this is the road that I want to be on, is helping Christian coaches grow personally and grow professionally. And this is a platform that I can do it with generosity, which is one of my values, because the podcast is absolutely free for you to listen in and for you to grow with. So Erica will be back the next week. I can't wait to have her back on the podcast and being my co-host and sharing with you as we share together about having real life conversations with Christian coaches. So remember, my friends, that every ordinary day has an extraordinary moment. You just have to look for them. Go out and serve and show up wonderfully as God has made and designed you. We will be back next week with our very first episode under our new podcast name, Real Life Conversations for Christian Coaches. Have a great week, everyone.